I think you could say that television may be the most preordained invention in the whole firmament of modern science. He mentioned to George Emerson that he had this idea. Because he was not steeped in what everybody knew could not be done, he went ahead and did things that prior to that had not been done. When they come over the hill to their new homestead in Rigby, Idaho, he sees that there are wires stretched between the buildings on this homestead, and he shouts out to the family, "This place has electricity."
And now, ladies and gentlemen, Binnall of America Audio with your host, Tim Binnall.
Hello there, my friends. This is Tim Binnall of BinnallofAmerica.com with another edition of Binnall of America Audio Season 2. It is March 3rd, 2007, and this week our guest is Paul Shatskin, author of The Boy Who Invented Television, which is the amazing story of Philo T. Farnsworth, who, as the title of Paul's book indicates, conceived of the electric television as a mere farm boy, solved the riddle that science and industry was struggling with at the time on how to make television a viable medium. We're going to explore the life and times of Philo T. Farnsworth here in today's episode. We're going to talk about what made his workspace so innovative and successful, his battles with financiers over what to do with television once the working model had been completed, his war with RCA, the radio giant of the time, that wanted to be at the forefront of television and found itself at odds with Philo Farnsworth, who owned the patents for TV. Plus, we're going to find out about Philo Farnsworth's post-television work, some amazing and pioneering research in thermonuclear fusion, and, of course, tons and tons more. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Paul Shatskin, let me tell you a little bit about him. Paul Shatskin has led a life of multiple and diverse pursuits. After graduating from Antioch College in 1973 with a degree in communications, he worked in the television industry in Hollywood and earned an Emmy nomination for his pioneering work in computerized videotape editing on the ABC TV comedy Barney Miller. His first book, published in 2002, was the biography of Philo T. Farnsworth, titled The Boy Who Invented Television. He is now researching and writing Defying Gravity, the parallel universe of T. Townsend Brown, which was originally envisioned as a sequel to the Farnsworth biography, but has since taken on an almost unimaginable life of its own. A native of New Jersey, Shatskin now lives with his wife Anne, 3 cats, and an old pickup truck near Nashville. His website on Philo Farnsworth is www.farnovision.com, FARNOVISION.com, and his overall website is www.49chevy.com. Without any further ado, let's rock and roll. This interview was recorded on January 12th, 2007. Paul Shatskin, talking about The Boy Who Invented Television on Binnall of America Audio, Season 2. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Binnall of America Audio. I want to welcome as our guest this week, Paul Shatskin. He is the author of the amazing book, The Boy Who Invented Television, a story of inspiration, persistence, and quiet passion. It's all about Philo T. Farnsworth, the inventor of television, and it follows the journey from the original thoughts that Philo had on putting together television to the creation of it, and then the amazing story and battle that went on once television became a viable commercial opportunity for some of the big corporations out there. I had the pleasure of interviewing Paul at the UFO Crash Retrieval Conference, where he tore down the house with an amazing presentation on T. Townsend Brown, and anyone who heard the Crash Retrieval Conference special may remember we asked Ryan Wood for some post-conference thoughts, and Paul Shatskin's presentation was one of the ones he said stood out as just an amazing presentation. After I got a chance to read the book here, The Boy Who Invented Television, I wanted to get Paul back on to do an extended discussion here on Philo T. Farnsworth. Paul, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start out first, before we get into Philo Farnsworth, let's talk about Paul Shatskin, your background, your bio. I was surprised to see here that you worked in television for quite some time, and Barney Miller, and that was pretty amazing. So tell us about your background, how you came upon the story and everything.
I graduated from college in 1973, so I'm kind of an old guy now. And during the time that I was in college at a branch of Antioch College in Maryland, I spent most of that time doing what we at the time called guerrilla video. Mm-hmm. This was when the very first Sony video portapacks came out. Nowadays, you know, everybody's got a portable video camera that fits in their pocket. But in those days, it was a revolutionary concept to be able to have a video recorder that could basically fit on a backpack and that you could carry into a community and do programming that way.
Yeah.
And that was what I had specialized in, and our guiding light, the Bible of that movement in the early 1970s, was a publication called Radical Software. And you can actually find those publications online now. I think it's either radicalsoftware.com or .org or Raindance Foundation. Of course, if you Google Radical Software, you can find those publications.
Yeah.
And just as I was graduating in the summer of 1973, an issue of Radical Software that had been assembled in San Francisco came out. And that is where I first learned of a man named Philo T. Farnsworth. I just learned a little bit in that issue of Radical Software about the seminal work that he had done in the 1920s and how he went on to fight with RCA over the patents that he obtained for the original concepts of electronic television. And I kind of stored that away. I think I may have made a mental note that it did seem odd that up until that point, I had never seen any popular lore. There's no folklore associated with the inventing of television, which is only curious because television is perhaps the most ubiquitous appliance in modern culture.
Yeah.
But there is really very little lore associated with its origin. So I've always had a kind of a backstage interest in matters of invention. I like to tell the story about when I was in the third grade and my mother was concerned that I wasn't reading enough, and she dragged me off to the library to get a book, and the book that I brought back was a Thomas Edison biography. So I guess I've always had some sort of deep-seated interest in matters of invention. So when I read this story about Philo T. Farnsworth, that was something that stuck with me. And later that same year, I went out to California right after I graduated from college. Eventually, as you said, I found my way to working on the Barney Miller Show. But during, I think, that first fall when I was out in California in 1973 and 74, well, there were two things that happened. One was I found a biography of Philo T. Farnsworth. It was a book written by a man named George Everson, who had been one of Farnsworth's benefactors in the 1920s. He wrote a book in 1949 called The Story of Television, The Life of Philo T. Farnsworth. And I just happened to find that book on a shelf in the stacks of the Santa Monica Library. But also that summer, shortly after I went out to California, I had a chance encounter with a community video cable access advocate who went by the name of Johnny Videotape. And I think he was in San Jose, California. And Johnny Videotape knew the guy who had assembled that issue of Radical Software that I'd seen earlier that summer.
Yeah.
And his name was Phil Geetson. And Phil Geetson knew Philo T. Farnsworth III, and it was through Johnny Videotape that I learned of Phil Geetson's stories about Philo T. Farnsworth. And at that point, I was pretty well hooked.
Yeah. Now let's dive in here to the Philo Farnsworth story. It's really fascinating, and especially as you said, the ubiquitous nature of television and how really a lot of people don't know about the origins of it. For starters, let's talk about Philo as a kid and how he sort of gravitated towards electronics and eventually sort of came up with this idea for television, in a very spontaneous sort of manner. What I liked about, especially that first chapter when the title is something like, They Have Electricity Here, it's really amazing to think about a time when electricity was like, the closest I can compare it to maybe now is like cable internet back when, when people were trying to get it, and if somebody had it, you were jealous, that kind of thing. It was like, it reminded me of that in a way.
Well, he grew up in dirt poor farm country in rural Utah. He was born, he was born in Provo, Utah. No, he was born in Beaver Creek, which is down in the southern part of Utah. And his family eventually migrated to a town in Idaho named Rigby, Idaho. And this was when he was about 11 years old, so it would have been around 1917. And though he had exposure to like mechanical phonographs and so forth, he really had no exposure to actual electricity. So the story that you're talking about in the book is when they come over the hill to their new homestead in Rigby, Idaho, he sees that there are wires stretched between the buildings on this homestead, and he shouts out to the family, "This place has electricity."
Yeah.
And as they descend into the valley where they were going to be living now, he was really going to have his first-hand experience with electricity. Prior to that, he had read about things like the telephone. He knew about electrical appliances, but I don't think he had ever seen it firsthand until they arrived in Rigby, Idaho.
That's just amazing to think about.
And it is. I mean, we're talking about a time when really steam power was still the dominant form of transportation, and horses were common, and it was compared to the environment we live in today, it was almost prehistoric times. But he had confided to his father when he was 6 years old, when he first began to learn of this world of invention that was beyond where they lived.
Yeah.
He confided in his father his hope that he had, quote, been born an inventor, unquote. And that was the way it was always put to me. He didn't say he wanted to grow up to be an inventor, but he recognized even at that young age that if that's what you're destined to be, that's something that's pre-coded into your soul's code. And so he told his father that he hoped he had been born an inventor, and he began to orchestrate and organize his activities in such a way that might realize that destiny.
And all this sort of leads up to the idea of the television. Not so much. Well, this is what I kind of want to ask you. What was the mood going on in electronics at that time? Was television something that people were talking about as a possibility, but they couldn't figure out how to do it? Because that seems to be where he came in. He figured out the mystery of how to actually put together the television and make it work as a viable concept. I
think you could say that television may be the most preordained invention in the whole firmament of modern science. Because by the time we get to the 1920s, we've got recorded sound and audio transmission through radio.
Yeah.
And we've got motion pictures, so we know that pictures can be recorded and transmitted. And now science is looking for the marriage of the two. They're looking for the way to send pictures through the air the same way sound was being sent through the air by radio, starting in, I guess the mid-1910s is when audio transmission began over radio. So it was expected that at some point, not far in the future, that the marriage of radio and movies would be accomplished.
Yeah.
And in fact, the earliest attempts to accomplish that were, in a sense, a marriage of those two technologies. They were an electromechanical contrivance. Mm-hmm. And these devices trace their origins back to about the 1880s when a man named Paul Nitkow first devised a disc scanning device. The challenge of transmitting pictures over the air is basically to disassemble the image into component parts and then string those component parts together as variations of light and dark, and string those together, transmit them over a wire or through the air, and then synchronize their reassembly on the receiving end.
Yeah.
And given the mentality of the day, the earliest attempts to achieve that were attempted with mechanical devices, the progenitor of which was the Nitkoff scanning disc. Imagine, if you will, just a flat disc, and poked into the surface of the disc is a spiral of holes. Mm-hmm. And as the disc spins on its axis, each hole will go past a photoelectric cell, transmitting a different line of light to that cell.
Yeah.
So now you can see that the mechanical device is transmitting light through this sequence of holes to a photoelectric cell, and you get a sense of how the image is being broken down into individual lines through this scanning sequence.
Yeah.
Is that clear?
Mm-hmm. I got it.
Okay, so that is the sort of thing that was being experimented with starting in the late 19th century, and was anticipated was going to be the way the television was going to be done going forward. But Philo Farnsworth, when he first started reading of these things, he knew that that system ultimately wasn't going to work. And I think part of his motivation was that having decided that he wanted a career as an inventor, he just sort of made the conclusion that television would be a good thing to invent.
Yeah.
That would lay a suitable foundation for a further career as an inventor.
Yeah.
And so he began to focus probably in 1919, 1920s. He began to absorb whatever information he could about the science that might be associated with transmitting pictures through the air. He learned first of the photoelectric effect. That's what Einstein won his Nobel Prize for in 1923. Mm-hmm. Everybody, of course, associates Einstein with relativity and so forth, but his Nobel Prize was awarded for his quantifying the photoelectric effect by which light striking certain metallic surfaces releases electrons. And that's one of the fundamental components of the television system. So he learned about that. He learned about electrons. He learned about magnetic deflection. He learned about cathode ray tubes, which was a new phenomenon at the time. And these are all the elements that are simmering in his brain.
Yeah.
In the summer of 1921, he wants to invent television. He learned about all these various components of the electronic universe. He knows that a mechanical system is never going to go fast enough to transmit a coherent image. And so he's focusing on all these elements, and then the story is that one day in the summer of 1921, he was riding behind a device called a disc harrow, which is a field tilling device. It's a bunch of metal discs on an axis. And he was riding this disc harrow behind a horse, and late in the afternoon, he reached the end of one of the rows that he had just plowed, in effect. And he turned around and he looked behind him, and he saw the rows that he had plowed in the dirt, the furrows that he had plowed in the dirt. And the story is that in that instant, he saw how all those elements, electrons, magnetic deflection, and cathode ray tubes, could be combined into a device that would enable him to scan an image with a beam of electrons, line by line, just as he had just plowed this field, line by line, in a vacuum tube. And that is the moment of conception where we go from the mechanical parts of a mechanical television system to a purely electronic television system, which 30 years later became the dominant force in the industry.
Exactly. And it almost kind of reminds me of Tesla, especially since the AC versus DC sort of thing too as well.
True. Yeah, there's always something coming in from the fringe.
Yeah.
And in this case, there had been a couple of suppositions of an electronic system or a cathode ray tube based system. There was a man in England named Campbell Swinton who hypothesized an electronic system. There was a man in Russia named Boris Rosing who hypothesized an electronic system based on cathode ray tubes. But I'm going to fast forward here because between the summer of 1921 mm-hmm. and the summer of 1927,
yeah.
Farnsworth taught himself even more. He now had a concept. He learned everything he needed to develop that concept. He really had no funding at his disposal until sometime in 1926, and a year later he produces the first workbench laboratory model of the concept that he had when he was a teenager in the summer of 1921. So the date that we use of the transition, the date of realization, is September 7th. 1927 is the day that Farnsworth demonstrated for the first time that an image, that intelligence could be focused on the bottom of one bottle and reappear on the bottom of another. And so that's sort of the flex point where the dream was realized and the transition from mechanical parts to quantum particles was completed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it became a matter of engineering, which took another 20 years.
Exactly. You sort of touched on here an interesting sort of window of time, which is, of course, when he first conceptualized it and then to when he had the working model. A very painful step for all inventions because that's when it goes from,
you had the idea to try and actually make it. And Philo went through a lot of interesting sort of steps there, and you mentioned George Everson, who was instrumental really in getting the whole thing up and running. And also, could you touch on a little bit of how they kept going for more funding, but everybody seemed to kind of want a second opinion from someone who was like an expert in various fields, and every time Philo would demonstrate his idea to them, he always seemed to wow them, and they were always like, this sounds like a great idea, it's going to work, and sort of kept impressing the various skeptics or people who wanted second opinions.
Well, most of the people that he was sharing his ideas with were not expert in the field to be able to say for themselves whether or not the ideas that they were hearing might be viable. But what you're describing is a period that begins, I don't remember the exact time, I think probably in the spring, late winter, early spring of 1926. It's been 5 years now since he's had his idea. And he's been carrying this idea around in his head, wondering where he's ever going to find the means to try to realize it.
Yeah.
And the story is that at one point he was actually thinking about drawing his ideas up and submitting them to like Popular Science magazine. He was on the verge of giving up, really. And he got a job during this period in the late winter, early spring of 1926, working first as a clerk for, and then eventually elevated himself to the level of manager of a community fund drive in Salt Lake City, Utah. And the man who hired him for that task was a man named George Everson. And he proved himself to be mechanically inclined and to have a great deal of innate ability, and George Everson kind of took a liking to him. And the story is that one afternoon when all the work was done, they were all kind of sitting around and having a bull session together, and George Everson asked Philo Farnsworth, so what are your plans? Are you going to go to college? Are you going to continue your education? And Philo said that he didn't really have the means to do that. I think at this point he had stopped calling himself Philo and begun calling himself Phil.
Yeah.
He had dropped the O, and so we're going to call him Phil from this point out.
Sounds good.
And he expressed his interest. He said he didn't really have the means to go to school, but he mentioned to George Everson that he had this idea. And it had been lurking in the back of his mind for a long time, and he didn't think he was ever going to find the means to develop it. And George Everson took the bait, and he asked Phil to elaborate on his idea, and Phil explained it was a system for television. And George Everson had no idea what he was talking about. The word television had not reached his ears yet. We're talking about 1926.
Yeah.
And fortunately, there was another person, a partner of George Everson's, a man named Leslie Gorell. And Gorell had enough technical background to understand what it was that Phil was talking about and to encourage George Everson, who is a man of some means, to take the suggestion seriously. So George Everson becomes Phil Farnsworth's champion during the summer of 1926 and travels all up and down the West Coast looking for potential backers for this wild idea that he's heard for something called television.
Yeah.
And he eventually winds up in the inner sanctum of the Crocker Bank in San Francisco. And as you say, there were any number of steps, hoops that Farnsworth had to go through where he would present his idea to somebody, and whoever he was presenting would say, well, that's a good idea. Let's let this guy look at it.
Yeah,
and then they bring in another guy, and another guy would look at it. And so he must have presented the idea a half a dozen times over the course of the summer. And then finally, George Everson meets up with a man named Jess McCarter, who was a colleague of his from the Crocker Bank. And Jess McCarter brings in a guy named Roy Bishop, who is a fairly savvy engineer and industrialist. And then Farnsworth comes up to San Francisco, and George takes him out and gets him a real nice suit. And they go and they do the presentation one more time. And Jess McCarter and Roy Bishop agree that if he will do his presentation for one more guy, that maybe they can find the funding for him. And they take him to see a guy named Otto Hahn, who is working on a refrigerator project for something called the Crocker Labs, which was actually one of Roy Bishop's concerns. And he listens to Farnsworth's idea and says, yes, he thinks very highly of it, and he thinks it'll work. It'll be very difficult, but he thinks that it's a viable concept. And as a consequence, Jesse McCarter and Roy Bishop pool about $25,000 and tell Philo T. Farnsworth that he's got a year to make a picture. So he goes back to Provo. He collects his fiancée, a woman named Elma. We call her Pem. And he collects her. They are hastily married. They go out to San Francisco. They set up a laboratory. Pem's brother Cliff comes on board as a glass blower, his precise qualifications for the job being none. Turns out to be an expert glass blower. He learns everything from scratch and produces by hand all the tubes that Phil Farnsworth is going to use to produce the first electronic television system. He's going to create not only the camera tube, which is called an image dissector, and the receiver tube, which is a cathode ray tube that Phil called an oscillite, but he creates some of the amplifier tubes as well. And it takes them a year. But from the time they set up shop in San Francisco in September of 1926 until September 7th of 1927, they produced a number of early models of the image dissector tube. And come September 1927, they conduct an experiment, and they using an incredibly powerful arc light, they shine the image of a simple straight line that's painted onto a glass slide. They shine this image onto the surface of an image dissector tube, and in the next room where they have the oscillite, the cathode ray tube, receiver tube, they can see when that image of the straight line is being rotated, counterclockwise or clockwise. They can see it vertical or horizontal.
Yeah.
And this tells them that the intelligence, so to speak, this image that's being transmitted on one tube is reappearing on another tube. And that shows them that the principle that Philo T. Farnsworth first had when he was in that potato field in Idaho 6 years earlier was, in fact, a viable concept and the path to all electronic television.
There you go. You were sort of talking about these California days. I really enjoyed the portion sort of that talks about this lab gang and the amazing folks that Phil assembled at the lab on 202 Green Street. Talk a little bit about those days. It sounds really exciting. That's the best way I could put it when I was reading the book. You almost wanted to be there during this time because it sounds like they were just doing some amazing stuff in California at that time.
Well, I think this is the embodiment of an axiom I heard a long time ago. And I don't know if somebody else said this or if this is just another old saying that I just made up. But there are times when ignorance can be an asset, because if you don't know what cannot be done, there is nothing that can prevent you from going ahead and doing it. Mm-hmm. And that is essentially the spirit that Philo T. Farnsworth surrounded himself with in the people that he hired to be part of this little nucleus of genius that he was forming. Now, the point to this exercise is that, remember, going back to the very beginning, Philo T. Farnsworth didn't set out to invent television.
Yeah.
Philo T. Farnsworth set out to be an inventor and to create the means by which he could follow his imagination down whatever path he found it taking him. And so he surrounded himself with creative individuals. I think the way it was explained to me was that it wasn't so much that they had education or experience, but that they had daring and that they were trainable.
Yeah.
So he was looking for people who were not the embodiment of orthodox science, but who shared within that spirit of adventure. And this became this little nucleus of people that we're talking about that he called his lab gang.
Yeah.
And they became very much an intimate group that worked long hours, doing fairly tedious work, but they all were united in their tremendous respect for Philo Farnsworth and his ability to inspire them to stretch themselves and extend themselves into areas that they didn't think they were capable of. And I mentioned Cliff Gardner a moment ago. He was Phil's brother-in-law, and he's pretty much the embodiment of that whole idea. He had no experience in the field of glass blowing. He had never fabricated a tube, but he wanted to be part of that whole experience, and so he went and learned everything that he needed to do. And then because he was not steeped in what everybody knew could not be done, he went ahead and did things that prior to that had not been done.
Yeah. the invention of television is sort of, we're past the concept part, we're in the actual, it's been made, and as you said, it took 20 years of engineering to sort of fine-tune.
You can't underestimate, now, before we move on to the engineering phase, I want to emphasize, if I can, the importance of this particular contribution, because when you talk about the history of television, you will find detractors and doubters who will tell you that there were hundreds, thousands of people who made contributions along the way. And that is certainly the case. But there was a point of transition. There was a flex point there when everything that went before became obsolete and everything that came after became possible. And that flex point, that idea that Farnsworth had in the potato field in 1921, the realization, the workbench model that he demonstrated in 1927, that's the point of transition. That's the pinch in the hourglass.
Yeah.
And it is truly one of the seminal moments in scientific history where the transition was completed, in effect, from a technological environment that was dominated by mechanics and parts to the environment that we live in today that is dominated by particles and quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
And all of that took place in Philo Farnsworth's mind and on Philo Farnsworth's workbench. And that is the flex point that made television possible. Now you can start talking about the hundreds and thousands of individuals who made improvements in engineering refinements that made television possible going into the 1940s and 50s. But it was that event, Farnsworth's contribution in 1921 to 1927, that made everything that comes after it possible.
Exactly.
Where were we?
Well, what I wanted to say was, from there, there's sort of a crux or a difference of opinion, if you will, with the backers for Philo Farnsworth and Farnsworth himself. He wanted to stay on the cusp of the development of the television and go through with these steps of engineering. And the bankers, it seemed like there was a constant battle with them not to just sell out and you know, we got it, we made it, we made the television, now let's sell it to people that can actually, you know, fine-tune it and move it out and, you know, cash out, if you will.
Yeah, almost from the moment that Farnsworth did his first demonstration, which would have been a little later in 1927, and there's one great story in the book where one of the backers was a wizened old banker from the gold rush days named J.J. Fagan. And Fagan kept asking Bill or George Jefferson, when are we going to see some dollar signs in those tubes of Farnsworth? And when it was time to demonstrate what he had done for his backers, he, in fact, painted the image of a dollar sign onto a glass slide. And when the bankers all came to see what they had created, that was the first image that they saw, was the image of a dollar sign on the face of a cathode ray tube. But almost within minutes of seeing that, the discussion changes direction.
Yeah.
And the drift of the whole environment changes. And even Roy Bishop, who had been something of a father figure to Farnsworth at that point, begins discussing the whole enterprise in terms of how are they going to sell it to, quote, one of the big electrical companies. We're now in an environment, we're talking about the late 1920s, where the pioneers of the 19th century, the Edisons, the Bells, the Morses, and so forth, the institutions that they had created, that had been built around their inventions, are now the vested interests of the 20th century. And they had the means, they had the control, they had the economic and financial and political power to control the introduction of new industry from that point. And some of Farnsworth's backers were of a mind to simply surrender what Farnsworth had created to one of those industries to let them continue with the refinement that was going to be necessary. I mean, it was clear at that point that it was going to take a lot of work to get it from the workbench to the marketplace, and none of these guys, like Jess McCarter or Roy Bishop or even George Jefferson, really had the stomach for what that was going to take. But Phil managed to prevail. Remember, again, he wanted to maintain this shop, and he knew that if they continued the work that they were doing, that over a period of reasonable time they would develop a portfolio of patents.
Yeah.
Not only the original patents, which were obtained in 1930, they were applied for in 1927 and issued in 1930, But not only those original patents, but there would be a whole portfolio based on those patents and including all the refinements that they would develop over time. And when the time came to turn that over to some other company, it would be a much more valuable portfolio than if they did it immediately, like back there in 1927 or 28. So he was able to prevail upon them to keep the enterprise going. But it was rather burdensome, to put it mildly, because the expenses were ratcheting up rapidly. And they had originally committed $25,000 to the initial enterprise, and by the time Farnsworth produced his first picture in September of 1927, they had spent twice that. So they were kind of losing patience, but somehow Farnsworth prevailed and managed to get them to continue. And he stayed in San Francisco under the aegis of various different configurations until about 1930 or 31. In fact, Roy Bishop, who had been one of the original benefactors, I think he stepped aside, and Jeff McCarter became pretty much the prime benefactor. And McCarter was really not an industrialist. He was not cut in the George Westinghouse or Thomas Edison mold. He was kind of a fast buck artist.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he became pretty much responsible for Farnsworth's future.